Wow, looking to parry those shots. Oh my!
Caught him with the spinning back kick.
He just stands right back up.
Oh!
Anderson.
Trying to finish it!
In the year 1993, a college dropout is riding a bicycle through the slushy, gray winter streets of South Boston. On his back, strapped to him like a second spine, is a hockey bag stuffed with 80 pounds of boxing equipment. His destination is not a gym with his name on it. His destination is a gym that will allow him inside. His name is Dana White. He earns his rent by teaching boxing fitness classes to housewives and businessmen, people who want the sweat of a fighter without the danger of one. Nobody in that city, not a single person, could have predicted that this man, with his hockey bag and his borrowed gym floor, would one day build a sports empire so vast, so dominant, that an entire government senator would stand on the floor of the United States Senate and personally try to kill it. And fail. Welcome to Infomundo, where we break down fascinating, worldwide famous topics and bring them to your screens. And today we are going to explain how a fitness freak built UFC, a $12 billion MMA empire. This is the story of how a broke fitness instructor from Boston turned a radioactive $2 million brand into a $12 billion global empire. This is the story of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and it begins, as all great things do, with almost nothing. Dana Frederick White Jr. was born on July 28, 1969, in Manchester, Connecticut. His mother was a nurse. His father was largely absent from his life. He and his sister Kelly were raised primarily by their mother and her extended family. A childhood that moved between Nevada and Maine, between small apartments and borrowed stability. The family relocated to Las Vegas when Dana was in 3rd grade because Las Vegas paid nurses more. Not exactly the origin story of a future billionaire. But here is where the first thread begins to pull. In Las Vegas, a young Dana White attended Bishop Gorman High School, where he sat in the same classrooms as a boy named Lorenzo Fertitta, heir to one of the city's most powerful casino families. They were not close friends. Not yet, but they knew each other's names. And in business, sometimes that is enough. Dana began his boxing training at 17 in 1987. He was not a prodigy. He was not destined for a professional ring. But he fell in love with the culture of fighting, the discipline, the hierarchy, the ritual of two people solving an ancient argument with their fists. He enrolled at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, then dropped out. College, he decided, was not where his answers lived. What came next was not glamorous. Dana White spent his early 20s shuffling between odd jobs, working a hotel front desk, tending bar at an Irish pub, always circling back to one thing, the gym. In the early 1990s, he moved to South Boston and partnered with Golden Gloves winner Peter Welch to open McDonough Gym. Their initial mission was noble and broke, making a program to get kids off the street through boxing. To keep the lights on, they started teaching boxing fitness classes to the neighborhood's working adults. The classes were packed. Businessmen in their 50s learned to jab. Housewives discovered their left hook. White would later describe these sessions. We weren't boxercise instructors. We taught boxing classes. It did really well. It did. Too well, as it turned out. The boxing classes expanded. White and Welch moved into regional health clubs across the city. The revenue was modest but real, and it caught the attention of the wrong people. South Boston in the early 1990s was controlled by one name, Whitey Bulger. His organization, the Winter Hill Gang, was the kind of criminal enterprise that didn't knock. One afternoon, Bulger's associate, Kevin Weeks, and other crew members walked into one of Dana White's boxing fitness classes and made their position clear. They wanted a cut, not a request, a tax. The number they named was $2,500. To anyone observing from outside, that seems manageable. To Dana White, who was barely paying his own rent, it was a threat that had no negotiated exit. He stalled. He kept his head down. He hoped they would find someone easier to squeeze. They did not. The phone call came to his home. The money was due by 1 p.m. the following day. The implication of not paying required no elaboration in South Boston. Dana White, in his own words, "I literally hung up the phone, picked up the phone, and called Delta and bought a ticket to Vegas." He packed a single bag and left. No goodbye tour, no final class. Just a man who understood, with absolute clarity, that some debts cannot be paid and some fights cannot be won in the conventional sense. Sometimes the smartest move is to find a different cage entirely. He landed in Las Vegas with very little money and one significant asset, the phone number of a boy he had gone to high school with named Lorenzo Fertitta. Las Vegas, 1992. Dana White is not yet a mogul. He is a fitness instructor with ambition and no particular vehicle for it. He established Dana White Enterprises and began running boxing aerobics classes across 3 gyms in the Las Vegas area. The classes were packed. He had a gift for making people feel the athletic drama of combat sports without requiring them to absorb a punch. But he was quietly doing something more important than teaching jabs. He was watching. He reconnected with Lorenzo Fertitta at a mutual friend's wedding, their first real conversation in 10 years. Lorenzo had followed the path his family laid out: executive at Station Casinos, former commissioner of the Nevada Athletic Commission, a man who understood regulatory systems and big money simultaneously. He introduced Dana to his older brother, Frank Fertitta III. The 3 of them began training jiu-jitsu together under John Lewis, a UFC veteran. They would train and they would talk about combat sports, specifically about an organization that was making a slow, chaotic, nationally embarrassing wreck of the sport Dana loved. That organization was the Ultimate Fighting Championship. The UFC had launched in November 1993 with a single combustible idea: which martial art is actually the best? Art Davie, Rorian Gracie, and filmmaker John Milius created an 8-man single elimination tournament with no weight classes, no time limits, and no unified rules. It was chaos marketed as sport, and it was compulsively watchable. Then Senator John McCain saw a videotape of the early events in 1996, stood on the Senate floor, and branded the UFC, quote, human cockfighting, end quote.
So UFC was kind of this crazy thing where it was like no rules, bare knuckle.
McCain came out and said,
what it was at the beginning was human cockfighting. It was.
This is human cockfighting here. Human cockfighting.
human cockfighting.
It's sort of like human cockfighting in my view.
In that moment, the entire enterprise was politically radioactive. Within months, the UFC was banned or blacklisted across 36 states. Major cable providers dropped its pay-per-view offering. The organization was forced to hold events on tribal lands and in tiny venues. Mississippi, Iowa, remote corners of the country where the law was slow. The brand was dying in real time. By 2001, the original owners, Semaphore Entertainment Group, SEG, were facing bankruptcy. They had stripped the company's assets trying to survive. When Dana White learned they were selling and called Lorenzo Fertitta, the situation was worse than even he had imagined.
Called the Fertitta brothers and said, I think the fucking UFC's in trouble. I think they're gonna go under, and I think we could buy the company, and I think we should.
The UFC.com domain name had been sold to a company called User Friendly Computers. The tape library was gone. International rights had been sold off. What remained was the brand name, 3 letters, and a battered wooden octagon. In January 2001, Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta purchased the UFC for $2 million through their newly formed company, Zuffa LLC, Italian for to fight. Dana White was installed as president and received an equity stake as both finder's fee and sweat equity. He owned a piece of a brand that most of the business world considered a liability, not an asset. Everyone thought they had lost their minds, and for the next 3 years, the evidence supported that view entirely. But before we explain more on how a fitness freak created UFC, a $12 billion MMA empire, just a quick reminder, if you're liking this video so far, you'll love what else we've built here on Infomundo. Check out the channel for more intriguing information on the world's most famous sites and stuff. Dana White's first move as UFC president was to make the sport survivable. He brought in the unified rules of mixed martial arts, time limits, weight classes, mandatory medical testing. He lobbied state athletic commissions. He brought Joe Rogan back on board, appointing him as a color commentator after Rogan had previously conducted backstage interviews at UFC 12 and 13 when he made his debut. What few people realized at the time was that Rogan often worked those early events for free, as the UFC simply couldn't afford to pay him.
It's a fact. He doesn't care about money. And he did the first 13 shows for free for us.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That was at a time when we were hurting, and he's like, wait a minute, you want me to do the commentary? You're saying that I get to sit in the best seat in the house and watch these fights for free?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in.
However, his love for the show was greater than any pay, and he wanted the best seats from all of them while doing the commentary of his life. So he showed up time and again, driven by a belief that one day this promotional company would touch the skies. UFC 30 and UFC 31, the first events under Zuffa ownership, were held at the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City, a venue that, unlike most of the country, would take their money. But the public wasn't interested. The human cockfighting label had done its damage. The pay-per-view numbers were dismal. Every event lost money. By 2004, the Fertitta brothers had pumped over $40 million into the UFC without achieving significant growth or reaching profitability. They were losing close to $1 million per event. Lorenzo Fertitta, a man who ran casinos, who understood the mathematics of risk at a professional level, called Dana and told him to find a buyer. The highest offer that came back was $4 million. They had spent $42 million to receive an offer of $4 million. That is not a setback. That is a catastrophe. A different kind of man would have taken the exit. Lorenzo Fertitta was not that man. Neither was Dana White. Instead, they did what the UFC had always done best. They took the biggest swing they had left. The idea arrived like most great ideas do, not from research or strategy consulting, but from a genuine question. What if people actually knew who these fighters were? Dana White, the Fertittas, and television producer Craig Piligian developed the concept of The Ultimate Fighter, a reality series where fighters would live together, train together, and compete for a UFC contract. Not just a fight show, a human show. They pitched it to every major network. HBO said no. Showtime said no. ESPN said no. Spike TV said yes, but with a condition. The UFC had to fund the production itself. White and the Fertittas put up $10 million of their own money for the right to air their own show on basic cable. If it failed, they were done. There was no more runway. This was it. The Ultimate Fighter Season 1 premiered in 2005. The numbers were modest, then decent, then, on April 9, 2005, everything changed. The live season finale featured Forrest Griffin versus Stephan Bonnar, a light heavyweight bout that no one had built any particular expectations around. What happened instead was 15 minutes of non-stop, back-and-forth, bloody, beautiful combat that television executives would have called unscriptable if it had been scripted. Viewers who tuned in halfway called their friends. Friends changed the channel. The Spike TV ratings climbed vertically during the second round and never came back down. By the final bell, the UFC was no longer a failing experiment. It was a phenomenon. Spike TV offered them a new deal before the broadcast had ended. Dana White has said it plainly. Without that specific fight between those specific two men on that specific night, the UFC would have closed its doors within the year. Instead, it would eventually become the most successful sports acquisition in modern history. After the Griffin-Bonnar finale, the UFC moved with speed. By 2006, UFC 66, headlined by Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz, generated over 1 million pay-per-view buyers, a number that certified the UFC as a mainstream sports property. By 2008, Forbes valued the company at $1.1 billion. They had turned $42 million in cumulative losses into a billion-dollar enterprise in 3 years. Then they started buying the competition. Between 2006 and 2011, the UFC systematically acquired every meaningful rival. They bought Pride FC in Japan, the WEC, bringing future stars like Jose Aldo, and Strikeforce, absorbing champions including Ronda Rousey and Daniel Cormier. This was not just talent acquisition. Each purchase came with tape libraries, the historical record of the sport. By owning those archives, the UFC became the sole institutional memory of MMA itself. The monopoly was structural, elegant, and total. In 2011, the UFC signed a multi-year television deal with Fox, moving the sport from the edges of cable to national broadcast, alongside the NFL and the MLB. The Fertitta brothers sold the UFC to WME IMG, now known as Endeavor, for $4.025 billion in 2016. It remains one of the largest sports acquisitions ever completed. Dana White, holding a 9% equity stake, walked away with approximately $360 million. He stayed on as president. The college dropout, with the hockey bag on his bicycle, had just cleared $360 million. The story did not end in 2016. In some ways, that was only Chapter 3. In September 2023, Endeavor merged the UFC with World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, to form TKO Group Holdings, listed on the NYSE under the ticker symbol TKO. The merger agreement valued the UFC alone at $12.1 billion. Dana White transitioned from UFC president to UFC chief executive officer within the new structure. In 2025, Forbes estimated Dana White's personal net worth at over $600 million. Meta Platforms elected him to its board of directors. He launched Power Slap, a slap fighting promotion, and co-created Zuffa Boxing, a new boxing league backed by Saudi Arabia's General Entertainment Authority. And then, in August 2025, the deal that rewrites the next decade arrived. The UFC announced a 7-year, $7.7 billion broadcast rights agreement with Paramount Skydance.
Paramount has just bought the TV rights to the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, in a multi-billion-dollar deal, making deals already.
Beginning in 2026, all UFC events will stream exclusively on Paramount Plus in the United States. The deal averages $1.1 billion per year, doubling the revenue of the previous ESPN arrangement almost precisely. The Fertitta brothers' original $2 million investment returned 6,050 times its value over 15 years. The most optimistic projections for that initial purchase, projections that no serious analyst in 2001 would have entertained, turned out to be too conservative. No empire this size arrives without shadows. The most sustained controversy surrounding the UFC is the question of fighter compensation. MMA analysts and former fighters estimate that UFC athletes receive somewhere between 13% and 20% of total revenue, a fraction compared to the approximately 50% revenue share in the NBA or NFL. A major antitrust lawsuit, known as Le Vis-a-Fa, was filed by former fighters alleging that the UFC used its market dominance to systematically suppress athlete wages. The legal proceedings continued. Then there is the person of Dana White himself. He is not a traditional corporate executive. He is brash, frequently profane in public settings, and has developed a reputation for blacklisting journalists and fighters who cross him. In December 2022, video surfaced of a physical altercation between White and his wife, Anne, during a New Year's Eve party in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. Both struck each other, both apologized publicly. The California Legislative Women's Caucus demanded his removal. He was not removed. His response to critics was characteristically unfiltered. He pointed out that him leaving would hurt the company, not him. This apparent immunity from the conventional rules of corporate accountability is, Dana White would argue, simply an accurate description of reality. The brand is so strong and his identity so fused with it that the organization has successfully operated on its own logic for over 2 decades. Whether that logic is admirable or troubling depends entirely on who is asking. Here is what is easy to miss when you look at a $12 billion number. It took 3 years of complete public failure before the UFC found its footing. It took $40 million spent without meaningful return before the business model clarified. It took a reality television finale that almost didn't happen to transform a dying promotion into a cultural institution. And it took a fitness instructor who understood, at a foundational level, why human beings are drawn to watching other human beings compete, bleed, and endure. Dana White's net worth is currently estimated at over $600 million by Forbes. He earns approximately $20 million annually as UFC CEO. He sits on the board of Meta Platforms. His $2 million investment in 2001 became hundreds of millions in return. And in 2026, the $7.7 billion Paramount deal begins, ensuring that the organization he saved with a borrowed television slot and a self-funded reality show will broadcast to nearly 1 billion households across more than 170 countries. The boy who rode a bicycle through the Boston snow with 80 pounds of boxing equipment strapped to his back did not succeed because he had resources. He succeeded because he had, more than anything, the refusal to accept that a setback was a conclusion. In business, as in the cage, the fight is never over until someone stops getting up. And there you go, how a fitness freak created UFC, a $12 billion MMA empire. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Infomundo. If you want to know how much truth Epstein files contain, then you must check out the video on the channel. And let us know in the comments what stuff we should dive into next.